In May, you said that the risk to children is very, very low, and that the reopening of primary schools wouldn't lead to an upswing in R if it was done very carefully. And I think you pointed out.
All of those are correct, but there's an additional point which I made, which I think is relevant to what Sir John said. And I have to say, in a sense, I agree with his general point, but it just factually wasn't correct in what I'd said, which is, I said in several of the things I sent you, and there were many others, I just chose those, also said extensively, actually, when giving evidence to the Select Committee in Parliament. I know you don't take those into account, but it was quite a lot of evidence on this point, that as a result of this, I said there were two possible reasons why you might close schools. One was for the protection of children, and that was not the reason we were doing this. And I've said that repeatedly through February, March, April, and indeed beyond that. The alternative, an additional reason, was because of the impact on the pandemic as a whole, and that were schools to close, because at the point I was saying this, it was a were schools to close stage. The reason would be because of the effect on the pandemic, not because schools were a particular risk to children. Now, I said that for three reasons. Firstly, that was what Sage was saying. Secondly, because it was clearly true but needed to be said. And the third was, while schools were open before they closed, it was important parents didn't think that there was a big risk to their children for children being in school at that point in the pandemic. And also I could see forward to when we were trying to reopen schools if they had to close, and it was important to lay down in public that was the situation, that the schools are not being closed for the protection of children, they've been closed because of the effect on the epidemic. So in a sense we made that point, or I made that point, many others did, but I made that point repeatedly over that period, but for that reason. So I agree with the broad point, I just wanted to clarify the record.
Yes, I mean, I think Sir John's point was, I think it was twofold. The first was he felt that there was a sort of void in the public argument prior to the opening of schools, and that government wasn't filling it in terms of putting forward the positive case why schools could reopen. So I think that was his first point, and therefore it was falling to people like him to try and address it. And then I think the second point that he was reflecting, Professor Whitty, was that obviously the provision of this consensus statement by you and the other chief medical officers of the United Kingdom was very important, but it came at quite a late stage.
Yes, I think, in a sense, I agree with all of Sir John's points. The only reason I responded to this was he made a thing of singling me out and saying I'd not said anything about this, which was factually incorrect. And that was the reason I put those out. But I also think it is worth making the point that the issue of schools being not, the reason for closing schools is not for the protection of the children. It was very important that point was made honestly and up front all the way through the pandemic, and it was. I gave you just the examples I gave, and many other people, Jenny Harries, for example, said very similar things in other environments. So this point was being made repeatedly. So John may not have heard them, that's fine. But actually the health side, as he puts it, were making these points all the way through. We were very consistent on our advice on this one.
All right, but can I just ask that it is correct that the consensus statement didn't come out until the 23rd of August, which is obviously just very shortly before schools reopened. Why was it late? Because it was responsive to the fact there were voices arguing against the closure of schools, rather than it being a positive, optimistic case as to why schools could reopen?
Well, parents will be very relieved by the fact that I very rarely write to parents. This was an exception to that, and the reason for that was that inevitably, my view and the view of all the other CMOs was that children had been out of school for a while, parents would be understandably nervous. Also, teachers and other school staff were nervous, and there were some voices, including some quite loud voices in the scientific community, who were arguing that schools should not open. Indeed, the British Medical Association argued that, various other bodies did as well, slightly to my surprise. And so my view was, firstly, the time to write to parents was when they were thinking of sending their children to school, rather than in the middle of a lockdown when schools were not being reopened anyway. That didn't seem to me a terribly helpful thing to do one way or the other. And secondly, because I did want to make sure that parents and school staff had, as best we could, a fair laying out of the evidence. So it wasn't a simple send your children to school, it's absolutely fine, it's great for them. It was a much more careful laying out of what we understood to be the science at this point in time. And that was because this was the stage at which parents would be making their decisions about whether to send their children to school or not, in terms of their own at least desire to do so. So our view was this was the point to lay this out in detail. But I do want to re-stress this was not, none of the points we made in the letter were new in the sense they'd all been put into the public domain at some point along the last previous months. What was new was just bringing them together in one form that we hope to be useful to parents, pupils and school staff, including teachers.
And maybe if we just pick that up from your witness statement, please, at INQ 000588064, page 34. I'm just going to jump straight to some of the points that may be important, Professor Whitty. But if we look at this and count, I think it's about 5 paragraphs down, evidence. So transmission of COVID-19 to children in schools does occur, but on current evidence, it's probably not a common route of transmission, and it may be lower in primary age children than secondary age. And then skipping one, and we'll pick this up again. This is the advice about shielding. So by this point being set out here, based on our better understanding of COVID-19, the great majority have now been advised that they do not need to do so again and that they should return to school. A small number of children under paediatric care have been or will be given individual advice about that. And again, if we just go over the page, setting out as well the position of teachers and other school staff as well. And I think if we look at the second paragraph, setting out that transmission of COVID-19 to staff members in school does occur, but that it may largely be staff to staff rather than from children. Is that correct?
Yes.
And if we go over the page, please, and the first paragraph, because schools connect households, it's likely opening schools will put some upward pressure on transmission more widely and therefore increase R. But making the point, and I think this had been said publicly before, that schools were much less important in the transmission of COVID-19 than it was the position in respect of flu.
Yes.
And then a couple of paragraphs down, opening schools may be as important in linking households indirectly, for example, by allowing parents to go back to work or meeting at the school gates or on public transport. Thank you, that can come down. So again, I think, is that a reflection of the lack, or I suppose that it was the lack of clear evidence that it was school closures of themselves that were important as opposed to all of these indirect impacts?
Yes, and I hope, because you've seen all the other documents around that, you would agree that that was an accurate reflection of what the scientific evidence that was being given inside government was at the time. So it was trying to be open with the public about exactly where we were.
And obviously that advice brings up the position of children who had been shielding before that point, or who were in families who had been shielding. And I think that in evidence that you'd given previously, I think you reflected that shielding was a voluntary act and that some people would continue sensibly to continue shielding after this point. But the advice at that point obviously put children in a different position because it wasn't voluntary. They had to go back to school unless they fell within that narrow band of children who were particularly immunosuppressed or had very specific reasons. So can I just ask you a little bit about that and the rationale for that, given that children didn't have a choice, they had to go back to school?
Well, I think that the key thing about shielding for adults, and I'll come on to children, but I think since that's the comparison, is that over time our understanding about the who was at risk from an adult point of view improved, but we still were of the view that there were a group of people who were significantly increased risk. And the reason that we felt that stopping shielding in the middle of 2020 was possible was because they had a very low risk because there was very little virus, because of all the work that people had done in the community to date, including the closing of schools. So the rates were incredibly low, if you recall, which I'm sure you do very clearly. The transmission in the middle of the year, it was very low. Number in hospital with COVID was relatively at a very, very low level. So the reason that we felt adults could stop shielding was not because we had a different view of their risk. We still thought they had a high risk, but because the epidemiology had changed. The situation in children was quite a different one, which was at the very beginning, and I was involved indirectly in this because it was the Office of CMO which did this. We had a list of conditions we thought children might be at particularly high risk of coming to serious harm. And as time went by, it became clear that two things, actually. The first was the harm that we thought these groups might have didn't in fact materialise, whereas it did for adults, although exactly who in adults changed. But with children, the risk was substantially lower than we initially thought it might be for these high-risk groups. And the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, who are experts in this area, kindly looked at this area and essentially said the great majority of these children are at trivially increased risk relative to all other children. That's not to say that some children don't come to harm, but for example, having asthma is not a reason why a child is likely to come to particular harm. At the same time, the low point in the epidemic, which was there in August and September, was also true for children as well as adults. But the difference between these was with adults that there was still an increased risk. Whereas our judgment now was that for children, we did not see this increased risk, with the exception of some very, very narrowly defined and generally very ill or under very severe treatment children, but the numbers for those were very small. So it was a very different situation from adults. From children, we were saying we thought there might be a risk and now there isn't a risk. Whereas for adults, we were saying we thought there's a risk, there is a risk, but the risk at this point in time is much lower. Those are quite different messages, and I think they point in quite different directions.
And what about children who lived with parents who were still at risk then? Was there not concern that these children, by returning to school, would go home and infect their at-risk parents? There was
accepted to be some risk of that, although lower for secondary children lower for primary children than for secondary children. The overall and this wasn't a scientific point, this is a policy point, but I think it was a very reasonable one. The overall view was that the risk to their shielding adult household member, usually a parent or grandparent, not invariably, will be increased somewhat, but the risk to this child for having them not able to go to school will have the risk of scarring their life chances indefinitely. And on policy terms, the risk-benefit, the overall judgment of the government, this wasn't a sage judgment, this is a government policy judgment, was the risk-benefit taking a child-centred approach was to prioritise the needs of the children. And I don't think actually anyone has pointed to convincing evidence that was with the benefit of hindsight, an incorrect judgment. And I think all the way through this module, you've heard the dangers of not allowing children to go to school, and that really does have to be given a strong priority in policy terms. So I think it was a perfectly reasonable policy decision for the policymakers to have taken.
Yeah, it may be a policy perspective, but I think maybe looking at it from the perspective of a child who might be very frightened of passing the virus on to their parent, that might be a very difficult position for them to be in.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, that's where hopefully good individualised, tailored discussions with GPs, with nurses, with school staff and others is going to be useful. It's not that child or young person is fairly unlikely to be swayed by a generic 5-minute statement in a very short press conference from someone like me. What they need to have is a conversation with the doctor that they and their family know, the nurse that they family know, etc. And those conversations were happening, I know, the whole time. And that's very much the way that kind of conversation needs to progress.
I think one of the other points that's made is, and I entirely, of course, on behalf of the inquiry, understand that Department for Education policy is a matter for the department rather than you, but parents being advised or families being advised that schools should bear in mind the potential concerns of pupils' parents and households who may be reluctant or anxious about returning, and put the right support in place to address this, which I think is the point that you're making. But suggesting that schools should provide reassurance to parents about the kind of measures that they put in place to reduce risk in schools. And I think the point being made is that schools aren't clinical settings and these aren't clinicians, and therefore not really in a position to provide the sorts of reassurance that families who are worried and deeply anxious might have.
I think there's, in a sense, that's a two-part piece of advice. The bit which belongs to the school, and rightly belongs to the school, is we are doing the following things. Those are statements of fact. And then the bit that belongs to the medical advice, which may be given at a high level by press conference, but actually probably is more usefully given by, for example, a school nurse or a school doctor or someone's individual doctor, is, and these things that are being done will materially reduce the risk. That's it. So it's essentially, there are two different professional groups who are going to be involved in this. The doctors can't say what is being done, that's for the schools, and the schools can't say, and this will be the effect on the transmission, that would be for the medical and nursing and other health staff.
Okay, I'm grateful, Professor Whitty. The other point that's being made about the consensus statement. So on the one hand, you have someone like Sir John Coles asking why wasn't this said more emphatically and clearer at an earlier point. I think on the other hand, there is opinion that the statement didn't make sufficiently clear the risks to children from long COVID, or for those small group of children who might be more severely clinically affected by it. Can I ask you about that, and whether there was reticence on the part of you and the other chief medical officers to point out the risks of long COVID for fear that it would then scare people into not sending their children back to school?
So I think, it's a perfectly reasonable question. I think if you look at your own expert witness statement on this, which I think is accurate, they make the point that the first reasonably consensus view about long COVID in children, A, occurred later than adults, for reasons we could go into if you're interested, for the inquiry's benefit, and B, was well after the time we sent this letter. So to warn parents of risk which at that point had not been identified would, I think, be difficult. It was clear that there were some adults who had prolonged symptoms. Indeed, it was clear there were some children who had prolonged symptoms. But the idea of long COVID in children was not really fully understood at this point. And that was in practice. Had we known at the point we wrote the letter what we knew 9 months later, we probably would have added one sentence into it, which is to say that some children do have long-term effects from this, because that would be an important and accurate point to add. However, I do think in general, we did make the point that some children, that although the risk of mortality was very low, there were some children, albeit a relatively small number compared to the overall, who had long-term effects. And to that extent, I think we captured the point. We weren't in any sense trying to take away from parents information that they would have wanted to have to make a decision. You can speculate, if we put in a sentence that said some children have long COVID, whether that would actually have led to a change. My suspicion is the answer would be no, but that, in a sense, that's pure speculation. But what we couldn't do is go ahead of the evidence which was there at the moment. So what we gave to parents and pupils and staff in schools and teachers was, as best as we could, a contemporaneous view about the evidence as it was at that point in time.
Professor Whitty, I'm going to move on to a different subject entirely and to try and make a little bit of progress on it before the short adjournment, which is the decision to close schools as was announced on the 4th of January. I think I can summarise some of the lead up to that from your statement, but you explain that in the autumn and winter of 2020 there was a second wave of the original Wuhan variant of COVID-19 and that was driving transmission up during that period. Is that correct?
Yes. So we start up to and including the sort of the beginning of December. The increases that we saw were driven by the original Wuhan variant almost entirely. There was a little bit in Kent of what then later became called the Alpha variant. As December went by, that became the dominant variant, first in the south of England and then across the rest of the UK. And that, unfortunately, was a substantially more transmissible virus, as people will recall. And so the second wave was in reality two different waves. It was a Wuhan original wave, if I can put it that way, and then an alpha wave, which overlapped with one another but were distinct from one another.
And can I just ask, just in terms of the practical consequences of that, does that mean that when the Kent variant emerged, that transmission rates were already quite high? In other words, you were starting from quite a high level of infection in the community to begin with?
So even if we'd not had the Kent variant, what became known as Alpha, we did have a significant wave of COVID due to the Wuhan variant, or the original variant, which was happening through November and December, which we had entirely expected, so that this wasn't a surprise. We were expecting in winter to have a second wave, and we did have a second wave, and that was the second wave, in a sense, we'd prepared for and expected. There was quite a heated debate within government about what was the right way to approach this, as was very clear from, I think, some of the Module 2 evidence you've seen. But one of the things which we thought it was possible to do was to spare schools, and that was a very clear policy decision, which we all thought was sensible, which was to do things we could, which would mean that we would bring the R for that wave down below 1, but without having to close schools. And that was achieved, actually, during the autumn and into the winter, the Christmas holiday. The problem we had was that the Alpha wave had an R which was substantially higher than that, and which all the things we'd previously used, which had managed to turn the corner on the original variant COVID, were just not capable of holding. And we were back to a situation we'd been right at the beginning of the pandemic, that we had a very, very rapidly rising wave, but with a higher rate of transmission, and indeed with some evidence that there was a greater proportion of the transmission in children, and that's what faced us towards the end of December, but that was different to what faced us at the beginning of December.
And I think just a short point, you touch on this in your statement, but whether or not decision-making about Christmas, whether or not that made the situation more difficult. I think you suggest in your statement, because it was quite last minute that the decisions were taken to impose more severe restrictions, that also contributed to the difficult situation reached in December.
So what I want to, I was on record as saying, including in press conferences at the time, that I was pretty doubtful we were in a good place on what we were doing running into Christmas. I won't rehash that ground, it belongs to a different module, but I don't actually think that even had we managed the pre-Christmas period, so from the sake of argument from mid-October through to the Christmas period optimally, I think we would still have been in a situation come January where we would have been faced with a wave we couldn't actually get on top of, short of interventions that had a big impact on schools. And so I don't want to imply that that, I think, rather messy period that led up to Christmas was the reason why the wave was difficult to achieve without to get on top of without schooling closing. Afterwards, I think they were separate, in the sense they were separate challenges.
But whatever you had to do in the January, had you had a more optimal approach, and I proved the term messy, that's not a criticism of you, but of others who are taking decisions, what you then had to do in January might have been different.
I think we'd have probably ended up in the same place, but in a more structured way. But there was also, as is obvious from the evidence that you've received from Sir Gavin Williamson and Mr Johnson, then Prime Minister, there was also a complicated political element to this, which was nothing to do with the epidemiology. It was to do with other factors.
So if we just pick that up maybe from your witness statement, Professor Whitty, and I think we have this from paragraph 4.1 onwards, but if I just look at 4.2, perhaps that can be brought up on screen. But I think you're setting out there that it's from the 11th of December that the impact of the Kent variant is starting to become apparent. Is that right?
Yes, I think from the 11th of December it was clear that this was a significant variant. I think the scale of what it was going to do for the country as a whole, at this point it wasn't clear, and that became clearer steadily as we went through December. So by mid-December it was clear this was going to become dominant, and by around about the 20th or 22nd of December it was clear that this was going to cause us a very serious problem indeed. And of course the UK was the first country, and specifically England was the first country which actually had this variant. So what we didn't have was any other country to say, well, what happened in that country. We were, in a sense, we were on our own in terms of the evidence on this one.
And I think we can probably deal with this quite quickly. It's set out over the page from paragraph 4.4 onwards, that you set out that on the 18th of December it was understood that there was a substantial increase in transmissibility because of this variant. If we look at paragraph 4.6, I'm just picking this up from the middle of the indented paragraph, there is high confidence that this variant is spreading faster than the other SARS variants circulating in the UK, based on several different analysis. And then setting out, we see just below that harder measures might need to be taken in order to deal with that. And if we go over the page, please, to paragraph 4.7, I think the important point for the purposes of this module, again, looking at the indented paragraph below, overall accumulating evidence is consistent with increased transmission occurring amongst school children when schools are open, particularly in children of secondary school age, and that's said with high confidence.
Yes, and I think it's important that, I'm not going to read out, but the rest of that paragraph is a demonstration of the fact that actually we now had evidence that every time schools closed, for example, for holidays or for half-term breaks, that led to a slowing of the pandemic, and then when they opened again, it took off again. So I think it was, again, further evidence that schools did have a role, but this was in the context of transmission among children. What we weren't able to say with confidence was the effect of that on the R with this new variant.
And I think, again, it's probably important to look at the last sentence of this. It's difficult to quantify the size of this effect, and it remains difficult to quantify the level of transmission taking place specifically within schools compared to other settings.
Exactly.
So even at this stage, it's not, do we take it from this, it's still not clear whether schools are having a direct effect as opposed to the indirect effects around schools being open.
Well, I think we were confident that they were having a direct and an indirect effect. What we weren't clear on was what the ratio between those two were, and indeed the interaction between school closures, including, in a sense, planned ones like holidays and half terms, with other things which happen. So people change. People who have children change their behaviour during holidays in a whole variety of different ways, which are to do with the fact that they've planned their holiday, for example, around when their children were going to go be home from school, so they leave work and all the things that follow from that. So you can't absolutely translate from a holiday experience on transmission to a sort of out of holiday, unplanned period. Those are potentially different behavioural things that are going to occur.
Okay, thank you. That can come down. I think the issue that arises and that's important in terms of this point in the chronology is that of testing and trying to understand the extent to which a testing regime in schools might have met the challenges that this new variant presented. I think that's probably a whole topic of questioning, but I had just wanted to ask if I can fit this in before the short adjournment. I'll try. We understand from the evidence that was given by Miss Ackland Hood that there were increasing asks being made of the Department for Education prior to this point about testing, and which the department understood that if they met, there was a prospect that schools could remain open. So I think the first question that arises is why these demands were being made of the Department for Education to increase the levels of testing that would be provided in schools.
Well, I think important to just clarify that these demands are not coming from me, from Sage, or anything of that sort. So, in a sense, I'm an indirect witness to this point, if you wish. This wasn't sent from my area. But the logic of this was that there was an understanding that before Christmas, and this is before the Kent, subsequently Alpha variant, became dominant, that R was above 1, and that although it looked as if with what was then called Tier 4 measures, while schools were closed, it was possible to keep that below the R below 1, or at least at 1 or below 1, in many parts of the country at least. There was a strong expectation that when schools reopened, this is before we get to the Alpha, I want to be clear about that this would then lead to an upswing again of the original Wuhan variant, and that would make it very difficult to open schools in the middle of winter, at the point in the year when the NHS is anyway under its greatest pressure for all the reasons that everyone knows. So there was a good logic, which was not really related to the Alpha variant. It was related to what had been happening to that point in time. And the view was, although the testing is not in any sense a panacea and will not replicate the effects of closing a school, what it may do is reduce the risk sufficiently that the opening of the schools won't lead to the R going above 1 again and the Wuhan variant taking off. Unfortunately, the arrival of the Alpha variant rendered all that moot, because then we had something which was substantially more transmissible, and the relatively marginal benefit that came out of the testing regime, not zero, and it was fantastic that the Department of Education did the things they did, it was not going to achieve getting R below 1 in terms of that component, the component that came from schools. That said, it was useful later for reopening schools, and I think it probably allowed us more confidently to reopen schools in March. So it wasn't wasted effort to that extent. But I think if you went back and reran that period absent Alpha, I think that what the Department of Education was doing would have made a useful, potentially very important difference. It's just that the Alpha wave was so much more powerful in terms of its transmissibility that it essentially overran those defences.
My lady, is that a convenient moment?
Certainly. I shall return at 2:20, and we will finish you today, I promise. All rise.
please?
Christopher Whitty.
Professor Whitty, I think you ought to have before you two witness statements which will come up. I think the first bears the number INQ 000 588046. Yes.
I'm just waiting for that now. Thank you.
And are you content that that witness statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I am.
And you ought to then have a second witness statement in Module 8, which is in fact your 10th witness statement in this inquiry, INQ 00 5888220. Yes?
Yes.
And are you content that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I am.
Thank you. Professor Whitty, I was going to begin your evidence at the start of the chronology, if I may, and ask you some questions about the outset of the pandemic. And specifically, if you can explain why SAGE first contemplated the closure of schools on the 4th of February 2020.
Thank you. So, in the pandemic, and based on the information we initially had from colleagues in China and then subsequently from other countries, notably Italy, we were confident that this was a respiratory pandemic, or at least a respiratory epidemic that had a potential to turn into a pandemic at the earliest stages. Secondly, we had reasonable evidence, not convincing evidence overwhelmingly, but reasonable evidence that children were relatively unaffected in terms of severity. We didn't have any evidence that was convincing on whether there was any reduction in transmission, and we thought there was a possibility that it was transmitting quite extensively through children, but with no or very few symptoms, so that was a possibility. In the context of respiratory epidemics and pandemics, and the best evidence for this is from influenza, which is a very different pandemic in some ways, but has some similarities, particularly the route of transmission. We know that the closure of schools has been associated with reductions of transmission, significant reductions of transmission in the case of influenza. And the reason for that is that children tend to mix together quite a lot. And in the case of influenza, and this was an important difference which we recognised from the beginning, because there's often some residual cross-reactivity from previous flu pandemics, there's often a disproportionate amount of transmission in influenza in children during a number of other technical differences between the early evidence, but our view was that from an early stage, the closure of schools is one of the tools that has been used in previous pandemics effectively, and therefore had to be considered in this one.
I think I'm probably going to preempt something that you might be asked in a moment, which is maybe just if you could slow down slightly.
I apologise.
And maybe it would help then to look at the influenza strategy to understand the background to this. And we have that at INQ 0000 22708. And I think if we look at page 39 of that, please. And paragraph 4.23. That sets out in that first paragraph that there were benefits in the context of an influenza pandemic of school closures. Is that right?
That is correct.
And it sets out that in order to be effective, that such closures would need to be prolonged. Is that also?
That is also correct. It differentiates between closures of individual schools for outbreaks and what it calls mass closures across a large area to try and control the epidemic. But in the second context, they would have to be prolonged to have their effect, and even more prolonged in the case of COVID.
That's what I was just going to ask you, looking at paragraph 4.24. I think where it says, under some circumstances, head teachers and their board of governors may take the decision to close individual establishments. That's reflecting that, the potential closure of individual schools within a pandemic. Is that right?
That is right. I think important to highlight, because the differences and similarities between influenza and COVID are quite important in these early weeks as we were trying to work out what to do, that in contrast to COVID, in influenza, a lot of the risk is to children. So therefore, there is a logic to closing individual schools which have an outbreak for the protection of children in a way that is less true, was less true for COVID, as far as we could see at this point. I also should say, in, I think, module 1 or 2, we discussed this document and did make the point that actually, in our view, this was written by people who'd just been through a very mild pandemic, and I think there are a number of weaknesses in this document as a whole, so I don't want to say this was our playbook, yes. But certainly schools were considered from really quite early on.
And just looking over the page, if we can, I can see it's there, it sets out, once the virus is more established in the country, the general policy would be that schools should not close unless there were local continuity reasons or particularly vulnerable children. This policy will be reviewed in light of information about how the pandemic is unfolding at the time. So again, one presumes in relation to flu, that point that once there has been a mass outbreak of flu, school closures become less important. Is that essentially what this guidance is saying?
Yes, and this is the bit which I think I would actually question, and that's because, and this goes back to the point I've just made, the people writing this had just been through a flu pandemic which actually had lower mortality than a seasonal flu in an average year. If we'd had a flu pandemic like the 1918-19 one, or even the ones we had in the 1950s, 1957 and the 60s, 1968, I don't actually think this necessarily would have been true, because at that point we'd have had quite significant mortality among children, and I think that would not have been good advice. So I think this really reflected the time it was written and the experiences of the people who wrote it.
I'm grateful. I'm just looking at paragraph 4.25. It goes on to set out that the impact of the closure of schools in similar settings on all sectors would have substantial economic and social consequences and disproportionately large effects on health and social care. And presumably that's just reflecting that if you close schools, many parents won't be able to work and may not be able to work in the health sector. Is that right?
That is right, and I think that clearly is true in a sense whenever you close schools. Yes. And as we'll probably come on to, the very strong view of both the scientists and public health people like myself and the policymakers was that closing schools had really negative effects for multiple reasons, particularly on children, but also more widely. So nobody wanted to do that except under absolute necessity.
But I think nonetheless at paragraph 4.25 it goes on to recognise that such a step would therefore only be taken in an influenza pandemic with a very high impact. So although school closures cannot be ruled out, it shouldn't be the primary focus of schools planning. So even this plan wasn't saying you can rule out school closures. Correct. Is that right?
Yeah.
And if we look at that policy, is it accurate to summarise it as saying that in the context of a flu pandemic, the general policy is that schools should not close, but in a flu of high impact, a different approach might have to be taken?
That is exactly right, yeah.
Did SAGE ever advise that this guidance on school closures specific to influenza could be read across to COVID-19?
Not specifically. So although there are, and I think it's clear in a sense if you read many of the SAGE minutes, although there's often a comment about using influenza assumptions, those are about numbers of deaths and a number of those kinds of metrics. They weren't about the policies to be used across the two pandemics. But in this particular case, in the case of schooling, certainly it was one of the measures that we would consider in any respiratory infection, but the key word there is consider rather than necessarily do, because everybody doesn't want to do them if we can avoid it.
And can we just maybe look at one of the examples of SAGE advice to see that distinction between applying some of the presumptions around the figures as opposed to the presumption that the policy applied? And that's IN 106-109, and I think we see this as the advice of the 13th of February. And if we go over, please. Yes, thank you. And if I could just ask you before we turn, please, at paragraph 5 of that advice of the 13th of February, it set out that SAGE and wider government should continue to work on the assumption that China will be unable to contain the epidemic. By this stage, how long had that assumption been in effect for?
Well, in practice, and this was explored in quite some detail in Module 2 in particular, but in practice, I think most of the scientific community considered by now this was very unlikely to be contained, not impossible, but very unlikely at this point, and therefore planning should always be on, in a sense, the worst case rather than the hoped-for scenario, and therefore the planning assumption should be it would not be contained, and then if we got a pleasant surprise, fine, but that was looking increasingly unlikely at this point.
And come back and look at that in the context of school closures. But just looking, if we can, please, page 2 at the bottom, it picks up the thread of school closures and it asks, or it sets out that consideration should be given to what the objective was of school closures and sets out that they potentially could delay the first wave of an epidemic or the peak. Is that right?
That's right.
And then it goes on, if we go over the page, please. It sets out at 13, in an influenza pandemic, school children are critical to transmission because they have less immunity and because of their social mixing patterns. But goes on to explain at 14 that the impact of COVID-19 wasn't well understood at this stage. Is that right?
That is correct, but the point on 15 is an important one.
Yes, that's what I was coming to. So yes, setting out that it wasn't known, but that it was known that the serial interval for COVID-19 was longer, yes.
That's correct, and as the other thing which was known at this point was that we would not have any residual immunity in adults, and therefore the differential between adults and children you might see in influenza would be much less likely.
And then looking, yes, so, and I think the critical point then in respect of the serial interval as well was that closures would have to last longer than they might do in an influenza pandemic.
To have the same effect, that's true, yes.
So again, is that an example of the distinction being drawn between the approach or the assumptions that might be correct of influenza but not necessarily correct of COVID-19?
Yes, that's right. And I think with the exception of the severity of the pandemic at a population level, most of these implied that, if anything, it was less likely to be useful in the context of COVID than in influenza.
Thank you. That can come down. Professor Whitty, I wasn't going to take you through all of the advice that was given by SAGE from the 4th of February onwards that relates to school closures. I was just going to ask you about some headlines and to confirm when that advice was given. But if at any stage you want me to take you to that advice, please do. Obviously, we've seen that from the 4th of February onwards, the closure of schools was contemplated, correct?
Yes.
From the 10th of February, it was being advised that the serial interval was longer, the point that we've just made, or we've just seen, meaning that schools would potentially have to be closed for longer if it were to have the same effect. I think from 11th of February, it was advised that the severity of disease in children might be less than that seen in adults.
Yes.
Is that correct? We've seen some of the advice given in respect of the 13th of February. From the 19th of February, it was being advised that larger impacts are seen when closures take place earlier in the pandemic.
That is right in the context of trying to delay a wave. It wouldn't be right necessarily in terms of trying to reduce the size of a peak, and I think that was made at other points along the SAGE sequence.
Just thinking about it in terms of school closures, though, does that distinction necessarily matter at this point?
I think it does matter, because if if what we were trying to do, and if you recall that we had the 4 stages: contain, delay, research, and mitigate, where, to be clear, those weren't sequential; those could happen in parallel, which is a point which I think sometimes gets missed. But there was no intention at any point in terms of the technical advice from SAGE to suggest that actually we should be closing schools to delay the wave. And the reason for that is that would have required schools to be one of the first things to close, and given all the negative downsides to that for children, for their welfare, and indeed for the wider society and economy, the decision was that that was not a sensible thing to be looking at technically. So the way in which school closures were considered was for the different aim to try and reduce the peak, and that for that you don't need to do it at the earliest possible opportunity.
I see. And maybe I'll come back and ask you about that just when we finish this section, if I may, of what the advice was demonstrating. On the 20th of February, and in fact this was seen on the 13th of February as well, there was advice that SPIMO should consider selective school closures and that there should be modelling in respect of that. Do you know if that modelling happened, and if there was a separate thread of work, as it were, that was considering selective school closures?
That became much better understood as the pandemic went on, but at this stage the view was we had so little information that being able to do that with any degree of reliability really wasn't possible. So although we were able to make some very broad comments, like a small number of people being in school probably didn't significantly reduce the impact of school closures later on, we weren't in a position to be able to give proper scientific advice to policymakers that said what the impacts of different forms of selective closure would be.
So does that mean that at this point in time, so if we're looking at the 13th